I stood in a packed courtroom, looked my stepmother in the eye, and said, "Dylan is not my father's son." Silence. My stepmother screamed. My brother, the one who once called me sister, collapsed right there. They stole everything from me, my name, my legacy, my life. But there's one thing they couldn't steal. The truth. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to witness our most shocking, twisted stories. The night air was sharp, biting through Scarlet's delivery jacket as she stood motionless at the edge of the Anderson estate's stone driveway. 7 years. That was how long it had been since she last stood here. 7 years since the gates slammed shut behind her. 7 years since her name, her blood was erased from the family she once believed would protect her. Now her breath curled white in the cold. Her delivery van rumbled quietly behind her engine still idling. She knew she shouldn't be here. Not with a customer waiting across town. Not with late-night roads slick with ice. But the estate, it pulled her back like gravity, like unfinished war. In the silence, she let the words fall inside her head. This empire used to belong to me. It wasn't nostalgia, it was fact, cold, brutal fact. She looked up. Beyond the towering iron gates, the Anderson mansion still stood in all its hollow grandeur. Lights glimmered across its many windows like eyes watching her. The grand stone facade, the manicured hedges, even the white marble lions flanking the front steps, nothing had changed. But everything inside had. That house, once her childhood castle, now felt more like a mausoleum for the person she used to be. She closed her eyes and the memories hit unbidden. Scarlet Anderson, the Golden Girl, the pride of the Anderson bloodline. People used to whisper her name in boardrooms. Daughter of Charles Anderson, the last true titan of their empire. She'd walked these marble halls in silk and confidence, shadowed only by the echo of her father's praise. "You're my heir, Scar," he'd say, hand firm on her shoulder. "The company, the estate, all of it yours." And she'd believed him. She'd believed him even after Evelyn arrived. Her father's new wife had smiled. Too sweet, touched her shoulder too softly. Scarlet was 17 when Evelyn stepped into the Anderson estate like she owned it. A woman with diamond eyes and lips, always curled in polite smiles but never warmth. Charles had called her stability. Scarlet had seen the calculation. But then, her father had died. Just like that, one late winter evening. A silent heart attack in his study. Evelyn found him, they said. Doctors were too late. And within days, everything changed. Scarlet remembered the reading of the will, or rather the day she expected it to be read. Because there was no reading, no announcement, just silence. Evelyn avoided her eyes. Dylan, her half-brother barely 16, then watched her with something colder than indifference. She used to braid his hair when he was a toddler. Now he looked past her like she didn't exist. When Scarlet pressed demanded answers, Evelyn simply said, "Your father made the right arrangements." 3 weeks later, the lawyer came. Quiet. Efficient. Documents were presented. The company shares were transferred. The estate legally reassigned. The family trust restructured. All of it. Gone. Scarlet's name wasn't there. Not on the documents, not in the signatures, not even on the guest list of her father's memorial. The whispers began before the body was even cold. She lost everything overnight. She must have done something. She wasn't even in the will. Scarlet fought. Of course she did. But against what? She had no documents, no voice loud enough to break the legal silence Evelyn cast over the Anderson name. Lawyers refused to meet with her. Bankers froze accounts she used since childhood. The family house staff stopped taking her calls. Then one cold afternoon, Evelyn summoned her to the front door. Scarlet stood in silk, clutching the pearl locket her father once gave her. Evelyn opened the door herself. "There's nothing left here for you, Scarlet," she said. Scarlet shook her head, confused, furious, betrayed. "This is my home." "Not anymore." That was when Dylan stepped out from behind Evelyn. Eyes dark, voice like stone. "You should go." Scarlet's voice cracked. "Dylan!" He looked at her like she was a stranger. "We're done." It happened fast. A valet dumped her suitcase on the steps. The front gates hissed open. And Scarlet, barefoot, heart splintered, walked out of the only home she'd ever known. The gates slammed shut behind her. No money, no lawyers, no father. Just silence. Her father's name, her name had been buried alongside his body. Scarlet's chest tightened at the memory. Standing here now, years later, her fists clenched at her sides, nails biting through thin fabric. She had been 19 when they erased her. 19. At an age where most were choosing colleges, she'd been choosing between food and rent, between humiliation and survival. The first job she could get was delivering newspapers at dawn, then groceries, then packages. The Anderson heir reduced to a delivery driver slinging boxes to downtown condos owned by people who once sought her father's signature. But Scarlet survived. She didn't fade. She didn't break. While Evelyn threw charity galas and Dylan inherited board seats, he didn't understand Scarlet plotted. She worked by day, studied by night, enrolled in law school under a false name, ate instant noodles between contracts, and every day she remembered. She remembered this driveway, these gates, this house, and tonight for reasons she couldn't explain she had come back. Not to knock, not yet. Just to remember, just to feel the stone beneath her boots, to smell the winter air sharp with pine and legacy, to remind herself of the promise she made 7 years ago on the day she lost everything. One day I will come back, but not to beg. Her radio crackled from the van, a delivery request, urgent. Scarlet turned slow, controlled. She walked back to the van like her soul weighed double. As she climbed into the driver's seat, her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching one last glimpse of the mansion behind her. And then she drove away, not because she was ready to forget, but because she was finally ready to fight. Scarlet yanked the delivery cart up the crumbling concrete stairs, each metal wheel thudding as it hit the next step. Her breath fogged in the winter air. 2 more flights, 3 more packages, and she could finally clock out. Maybe. At the top of the steps, the penthouse door loomed. She knocked twice. Silence. Then the door creaked open an inch. A woman in a silk robe peered out, phone pressed to her ear. Her perfume hit first sharp, expensive, artificial. "You're late," the woman snapped. Scarlet forced a thin smile. "Traffic? Not my problem." Scarlet said nothing as she maneuvered the cart closer. The woman waved a manicured hand dismissively and turned back to her phone conversation. "Yes, I told Carter if the figures don't hit by quarter end, he's fired. Tell him that." Scarlet scanned the boxes, wine crates, Italian linens, custom furniture from Paris. Excess. When she asked for a signature, the woman frowned. "Can't you just sign it yourself like you people do?" Scarlet hesitated, pen in hand. "Ma'am, it's policy." The woman's eyes flickered, narrowed. "Don't get smart." A flash of heat ran through Scarlet's chest, but she said nothing, just handed over the clipboard. The woman scribbled something illegible, thrust it back without looking, and slammed the door. Scarlet stood there for a beat longer than she should have. "You people!" She clenched her jaw, turned, and dragged the empty cart back toward the elevator. In the reflective chrome of the doors, she caught her own face. Wind-chapped skin hair tied back, 2 tight circles beneath her eyes that even caffeine couldn't hide. She looked nothing like an Anderson. That was the point. The elevator groaned as it descended. When the door slid open, Scarlet stepped into the cold, hollow parking garage. Fluorescent lights hummed above her. She exhaled a long, slow release before loading the cart back into her battered delivery van. As she slammed the rear door shut, her phone buzzed. "Class starts in 20 minutes. She wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her glove, then climbed behind the wheel and drove. The classroom smelled like dust and exhaustion. Scarlet sat near the back hood, up head low. She kept to herself. Always. No one here knew who she really was. Not the professors, not the students. Scarlet Anderson didn't exist inside these walls. Here she was just a night student in a faded black hoodie catching up on a life stolen from her. She flipped open her battered laptop. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from hunger. She hadn't eaten since noon. The shift had run long. At the front of the lecture hall, the professor's voice droned about trusts, inheritance law, contested wills. Scarlet's focus sharpened like a blade. Tonight's topic wasn't theory. It was strategy. She scribbled notes furiously, her mind a storm of details. She knew her mother's maiden name. She knew her father's original trustee. She knew the difference between a revocable and irrevocable trust. But knowing wasn't enough. She needed to understand how to burn it all down. As the lecture ended, the professor dismissed the class and students filed out quickly, some for late shifts, others for bars. Scarlet remained in her seat until the room emptied. Only then did she move. She packed her laptop, slung her worn satchel over her shoulder, and headed toward the side door. But before she could disappear into the cold night, a voice stopped her. "You're early this week." Scarlet froze, then slowly turned. Mr. Milton stood leaning casually against the doorway. Gray hair, older, sharp eyes that missed nothing. He wore no tie, just a charcoal sweater sleeves pushed to his elbows like a man ready to work. She said nothing, just tightened her grip on the strap of her satchel. Milton nodded towards the empty lecture hall. "Inheritance laws bore you too, huh?" She shrugged. Milton smirked, pushed off the wall, and motioned for her to follow. "Come on." Scarlet hesitated, then followed. They crossed the darkened campus in silence until they reached the old library annex long since converted into private study rooms. Milton unlocked one of the doors, stepped inside, flicked on a lamp. The walls were lined with case files, legal texts, coffee-stained papers. Scarlet entered behind him, pulled her hood down. Only in this room did she become herself again, or whatever was left. Milton sat behind this desk and studied her. "You found something," he said simply. Scarlet reached into her bag. From the bottom beneath old bills and energy bar wrappers, she pulled out the folded legal document. She set it down carefully, a single notarized page. Milton unfolded it, scanned it once, twice, and then let out a low whistle. "Your father's trust." Amended version, Scarlet said, voice tight. "Signed 6 months before his death." Milton's expression darkened. "Convenient." Scarlet leaned forward, eyes burning. "It's a fake." "You can prove that." "I will." Milton looked up. "You think Evelyn forged it?" Scarlet said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence between them was answer enough. Milton sat back, slowly nodding to himself. They'd had this conversation before. Variations of it. Always circling the truth like wolves afraid to name the prey. But tonight was different. Tonight, Scarlet wasn't asking for knowledge. She was preparing for war. Milton tapped the document. "If you file, you're all in." "I know." "They'll come after you." "They already did." A pause. Then Milton nodded. "Good." From a drawer, he pulled out a battered folder. He tossed it onto the desk. "Case studies. Precedents. Read them." Scarlet reached for the folder, but Milton's voice stopped her. "Why now, Scarlet?" She looked up. He rarely used her name. Her real one. She hesitated. Then finally she answered. "Because I'm done surviving." She took the folder, and this time her hands didn't shake. Scarlet knew something was wrong the moment she opened the old storage locker. The dust hit first thick, stale, heavy, like forgotten years pressed into concrete walls. Her flashlight flickered once, then steadied. The air was colder in here, somehow heavier, as if the silence itself had weight. She stepped inside slowly, careful not to let the metal door slam shut behind her. Her father's files were supposed to be here. 3 shelves. That's where the Anderson estate archives had always been kept. Handwritten ledgers, signed amendments, generational records. He had trusted no one else to manage them, not even Evelyn. Scarlet moved quickly now, breath-sharp, heart pounding. Empty. The shelves were bare. Not just bare. Stripped. Scarlet scanned the unit again. Top to bottom, floor to ceiling. She kicked aside the fallen box lids, crouched opened file drawers that used to be full. Nothing. Every trace of her father's legal history gone. She stood frozen in the center of the room, flashlight trembling in her grip. Her mind raced. Evelyn. Of course. Scarlet stepped back, heart hammering in her chest, her entire body locking up with the one realization she'd been too proud to say aloud they knew. Evelyn knew she was coming, and they'd started erasing her all over again. She stumbled back out into the night, breathing hard, her hands cold with sweat. This wasn't just inheritance. This was war. An hour later, Scarlet sat in her parked van outside a quiet suburban home on the east end of the city. Her knuckles white around the steering wheel, her lips cracked from biting them raw. Helen, the last possible door. Helen Hayes, her father's personal assistant for nearly 20 years. The woman who knew every signature, every contract, every whispered instruction that Charles Anderson had ever given. If anyone had answers, it was Helen. Scarlet stared at the warm porch light glowing ahead of her. She imagined Helen inside, probably making tea, probably reading the same battered hardcover she always carried to the office. Just knock, Scarlet told herself. But her body refused to move. Because if Helen said no, if even Helen had abandoned her, Scarlet squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the spiral. Her fingers hovered over the ignition key. Then slowly she exhaled and opened the door. The knock echoed too loud in the quiet night. It took a minute before the door creaked open. Helen stood there. Older now. Smaller than Scarlet remembered. Her short hair grayer, her shoulders slightly stooped. But her eyes, the sharp, calculating eyes of the woman who once ran the Anderson Empire from the shadows, were just the same. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Helen's voice tired but calm Scarlet. Scarlet swallowed. I need your help. Helen studied her carefully. Not cruelly, not kindly either. Just carefully. Please, Scarlet whispered. A pause. Then softly Helen shook her head. I can't. The words hit harder than Scarlet expected. She stepped forward, instinctively desperate, but Helen's hand lifted an invisible wall. Scarlet's throat tightened. Why? Helen's voice was steady. Because it wouldn't change anything. You know that's not true? Helen looked away just briefly. Scarlet's voice cracked. He trusted you. I know. And you're going to let them... Scarlet stopped herself, her voice choking. Helen finally looked her in the eye again, and Scarlet saw it then. The guilt, the exhaustion, and beneath it fear. I'm sorry, Scarlet, Helen said, voice softer now. I truly am. Scarlet felt something in her crack. Her fists trembled. But you know, Helen added quietly, they don't erase people with signatures anymore. What? They erase them with silence. And with that, Helen closed the door. Not slammed, just closed. Scarlet stood there for a long time in the cold. She didn't remember driving home. The night blurred around her. The streetlights smeared into long, trembling lines. Her body moved automatically, turning corners, shifting gears while her mind unraveled piece by piece. The storage locker, empty. Helen, refusing. They had taken everything, again. Her father's name, his records, his promises, gone. She pulled into the cracked asphalt lot of her apartment complex, parked badly, and killed the engine. The silence felt heavier than the night. In her tiny apartment, Scarlet dropped her bag by the door without looking. She moved like a ghost across the darkened kitchen, flicked on the lone lamp beside the couch. The bulb buzzed weakly. She reached up and pulled the old photograph from the shelf. Her mother's face looked back at her. Elizabeth Anderson, dead 12 years now. Her smile in the photo was soft, honest, the way only a mother's could be. Her hand rested on Scarlet's shoulder in the image, that small, warm touch. Scarlet remembered it, not like a memory, but like an ache. She sank onto the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, the photograph balanced carefully in her shaking hands. Mom, her voice cracked. Tears burned down her cheeks, soundless, hot. I tried, she whispered. I swear to God I tried. And in the silence surrounded by the echoes of a family that no longer claimed her, Scarlet broke. She let the tears fall freely now, clinging to the only piece of her past that Evelyn couldn't steal. Her mother's eyes. Scarlet closed her own and let the darkness hold her. The old safe wasn't supposed to exist. Scarlet knelt in the corner of her father's abandoned study, the floorboards cold beneath her knees. Her hands trembled as she brushed away years of dust and splinters, revealing the faint outline of the hidden compartment. She remembered this room, the smell of her father's aftershave, the way he'd tap the side of his whiskey glass when thinking, the hum of classical music low in the background, and the sound of his voice telling her bedtime stories right here when she was just a child. Now it felt like desecration. Scarlet pulled at this panel until it came loose with a quiet pop. Behind it, a steel safe no bigger than a toolbox. She stared at it for a long moment. Her father never mentioned this. Never. And yet there it was. She dug through her bag, pulling out the single key Helen once gave her years ago, a key to her father's desk drawer. Maybe it wasn't meant for just that. She slid the key into the lock, held her breath, and turned. Click! The safe opened. Scarlet's pulse roared in her ears. Inside were only 3 things. An envelope, a leather-bound notebook, and a small, neatly folded letter marked simply for Scarlet. Her hands shook as she reached for the envelope first. Official, sealed, medical. She read the header once, then again, and her body went numb. DNA paternity report. Her father's name, Dylan's name, and under the column labeled probability of paternity, the number hit her like a bullet. 0.0%. Scarlet stopped breathing. She blinked hard, but the numbers didn't change. Her half-brother? Her father's son. Wasn't. Not by blood. Not at all. She pressed her knuckles against her lips, trying to choke down the rising sob, but it broke free anyway. The DNA report slipped from her fingers, floating silently to the dusty floor. Her mind splintered. Her world already cracked, shattered. Dylan wasn't Anderson blood. He was nothing. A lie. A replacement. A weapon used to cut her out. And her father had known. The notebook. Her fingers moved before her mind caught up. She flipped it open. Inside, her father's handwriting. Scrawled notes. Dates. Observations. Descriptions of Evelyn. Questions he'd been too afraid to ask out loud, and fears he had no time to confirm before death took him. Scarlet swallowed hard, skimming pages. He had suspected. He had ordered the test in secret. He had hidden the results, not to protect Evelyn, but to protect Scarlet, because the last entry, written just 2 days before he died, bled like a confession across the page. If something happens to me, tell Scarlet the truth. She's stronger than Evelyn thinks. Stronger than I was. Scarlet slammed the notebook shut, her body rocking as a sob tore out of her chest. He'd known. And he'd died before he could warn her. How long had Evelyn known? How long had Dylan? Scarlet felt herself crumpling forward, hands pressed into the floor as she gasped for air. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Evelyn had ever done. Dylan, her childhood shadow. Her baby brother. He'd known. He'd taken everything her father built and worn the name like a crown. Knowing. Scarlet collapsed fully onto the floor, fists clenched so tight her nails pierced her palms. For long minutes she lay there, paralyzed, empty. Then slowly, a sound escaped her. Not a sob, not a scream. A laugh. Hollow. Broken. And then silence. She sat up slow mechanical, her face streaked with dust and tears, her hands trembling, her chest still heaving, but her eyes were different now. No more grief, no more disbelief, only something cold and sharp. Resolve! Scarlet wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. She reached down and picked up the DNA report from the floor, smoothing it carefully. Her fingers no longer trembled. She took the notebook, placed it gently back into the safe alongside the letter she wasn't ready to read yet. Not yet. She locked the safe, slid the panel back into place, and stood. In that moment, she understood. This wasn't about money, or property, or inheritance. Evelyn had never wanted control of the Anderson empire. She wanted to erase Anderson blood from it entirely. Scarlet stared at the door of the study for a long time, then whispered to herself, voice raw but steady. They took everything. A pause. Her grip tightened around the DNA report. Now I'll take it back. She walked out of the room. Her footsteps didn't echo. They struck, one after another, like the beginning of a war. And this time Scarlet wasn't coming to plead. She was coming to end it. Scarlet spread the documents across her apartment floor like a battlefield map. Paternity test, her father's last notebook, financial statements pulled from public records. Everything she had was fragmented, incomplete, but it was enough to start. The old anger inside her had hardened now. It wasn't grief anymore. It wasn't confusion. It was focus. For 7 years, Evelyn had played her game. Now Scarlet would play hers. She grabbed a worn legal pad and began drafting the skeleton of her case. Her handwriting was sharp, clinical, nothing like the girl who once signed birthday cards with hearts beside her name. Claim 1, fraudulent amendment of inheritance trust. Claim 2, will falsification conspiracy with legal counsel. Claim 3, deliberate concealment of paternity evidence. She paused, then underlined the word conspiracy twice. She pulled the DNA report closer, her eyes scanning it again. Dylan's name. Her father's. The 0% probability circled in red. That alone wasn't enough to win. Not yet, but it was enough to destroy. She flipped open her laptop. First target, Benjamin Calloway. The family lawyer, her father's legal counsel for over a decade, and the man who, according to Evelyn, had handled all trust restructuring after Charles Anderson's death. Scarlet typed faster, now fingers moving like blades. Every public record, every company registration, every bar association file. She dug through his property records, searching for recent transfers, sudden shifts in assets. She found them. 3 months after her father's death, Calloway bought a property on the East Coast, a house far beyond the range of a mid-tier attorney's salary. The transaction filtered through 2 shell corporations. Scarlet's lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned back and whispered to the empty apartment, "She paid you." She pulled up the case file, drafted his name beside Evelyn's. The co-conspirators. Next step timelines. Scarlet knew how legal documentation worked. Dates mattered, especially when documents were backdated to conceal fraud. Her father's death certificate signed June 7th. The new trust papers filed June 4th. 3 days earlier. She sat in silence, letting that sink in. The paperwork had been prepared while her father was still alive. Her stomach churned. She swallowed hard against the bile rising in her throat. This wasn't theft. This was premeditated. Her phone buzzed. She stared at the screen. Helen. Scarlet hesitated, then answered. "I know why you're calling," Helen said quietly. Scarlet's throat tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" Silence. Scarlet's voice cracked. He knew Helen. "I know. You watched them erase me." Helen's voice faltered. "I watched them erase him." Scarlet froze. Helen's words were soft, but each syllable cut like glass. "Your father tried to stop her, Scarlet. He found out about Dylan. That's why the amendments were rushed." Scarlet's breath hitched. "He confronted her." Helen inhaled shakily. "He came to me 2 days before he died. He told me he was rewriting the trust. He said he was removing Dylan." Scarlet's entire world tilted. "He wanted to restore everything to you. And I never saw him again." Scarlet closed her eyes. The truth felt heavier than betrayal. Her father had died with her name on his lips. Helen's voice trembled. "He left a message for you." Scarlet barely whispered. "What did he say?" Helen paused, then spoke the words slowly, as if they weighed her down too. "Tell her. I should have listened sooner." Scarlet's tears fell silently down her cheeks. Helen's voice cracked. "I failed him, and I failed you." "No. You're fighting alone." "I'm not." Scarlet's voice hardened. "Not anymore." Helen was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier, stronger. "I kept one thing." Scarlet's breath caught. "What?" "The first draft of your father's rewritten will. His signature, his seal. I have it." Scarlet's heart stopped. "And I'll give it to you," Scarlet whispered. "Why now?" "Because this time, I choose you." The call ended. Scarlet sat frozen, tears hot, but eyes cold. Slowly, she picked up the legal pad, crossed out fragmented evidence, wrote in its place, Exhibit A, original unfiled will in possession. Everything changed in that moment. Scarlet stood, wiped her face, and spoke aloud to the empty apartment. War starts now. Scarlet stood alone in the marble lobby of the county courthouse, her breath-shallow fists clenched inside the pockets of her worn coat. In front of her, a stack of case files rested in the clerk's glass window. Her name stamped in black ink across every form: Scarlet Anderson versus Evelyn Anderson, Dylan Reed Anderson, Benjamin Calloway. This was it. She wasn't standing outside the gates anymore. She was inside, taking everything back. The clerk behind the glass counted the filing fees, glanced once at her, but didn't ask questions. Another lawsuit. Another name. But to Scarlet, this wasn't paperwork. It was the first blow. When the final document hit the tray, the clerk slid it back under the glass. Your case is officially filed. Scarlet's fingers hovered, then pressed against the cold surface. The stamped receipt felt heavier than it should. Good luck, the clerk added, soft but not unkind. Scarlet didn't respond. She just took the paper and walked out. Evelyn's reaction came faster than Scarlet expected. By the next morning, her name wasn't a secret anymore. Anderson heiress sues stepmother in inheritance scandal. The headline flashed across digital billboards. News anchors speculated over old family photos of Scarlet, photos she hadn't even realized the press still had. A teenage girl smiling behind her father, frozen in time before everything shattered. Now she was the story. Scarlet sat in the corner of her tiny apartment TV, flickering in the dark laptop, glowing with endless notifications. Her hands didn't tremble. Her jaw did. Every major outlet ran the same narrative. Estranged daughter of Charles Anderson returns to reclaim fortune. Anderson legacy in turmoil. Mystery son Dylan Reed Anderson named in court filing. She closed the laptop, let the darkness return. Her phone vibrated against the floor. Unknown number. She answered. She didn't speak. But the voice on the other end did. Evelyn. Calm, controlled, like nothing had happened. You're making a mistake. Scarlet's throat tightened. Evelyn didn't wait for a reply. I tried to be merciful, Scarlet, I really did. Scarlet's voice, when it came, was a rasp. You lied. Evelyn let out a soft, patronizing breath. That's your version. There's a DNA report. People don't care about blood. They care about power. Scarlet swallowed back the scream clawing at her throat. You should have stayed quiet. Evelyn continued softly. You were good at that once. Scarlet's fingers tightened around the phone until her knuckles turned white. I won't stop, she whispered. You will. The line went dead. Scarlet sat frozen in the silence, then stood. Dylan appeared 2 days later. Not in a press release, not in a statement. In person. Scarlet watched him step onto the courthouse steps beside Evelyn like a stranger wearing her brother's skin. He looked taller, colder, expensive suit, polished shoes, eyes like glass. The reporters swarmed. Dylan, are you Charles Anderson's rightful heir? Is your sister mentally unstable? Dylan didn't flinch. Evelyn stepped forward and spoke for him. My son has nothing to prove to anyone, she said, voice perfectly measured for the cameras. What's happening here is deeply tragic. A young woman clearly unwell, lashing out after years of personal hardship. Scarlet watched from across the street. Invisible. The words hit harder than expected. Unwell. Mentally unstable. It wasn't enough to erase her name. Now they were erasing her mind. Evelyn continued her performance flawless. We will pursue full legal remedies to protect our family, including a formal psychological evaluation. Dylan said nothing. He didn't even look toward the cameras. Scarlet's hands trembled inside her coat pockets. He used to beg me to teach him to ride a bike. She turned away before the tears could fall. The next morning, the attack formalized. A countersuit, filed by Evelyn Anderson's legal team, accusing Scarlet of emotional instability, erratic behavior, and historical patterns of psychological distress. They called for an emergency psychiatric review. Scarlet's legal notification arrived folded neatly on her doorstep, like a death sentence waiting to be opened. She sat at her kitchen table, unwrapped the paper, read every word. And then, for the first time since filing, her hands shook. They're not fighting me in court. They're fighting who I am. Her breath hitched. She closed her eyes. In the silence, her father's voice echoed from memory. If something happens to me, tell Scarlet the truth. Scarlet folded the countersuit, placed it beside the DNA report, then whispered, steady now. You told me, Dad. She stood. The war wasn't legal anymore. It was personal, and she would not break. The cameras were smaller than Scarlet remembered. 3 handheld units, a single tripod in the corner. No big satellite trucks, no networks. Just local reporters, bloggers, a few regional freelancers hungry for a story. That was all she could afford. But as Scarlet stood behind the scratched wooden podium in the back room of the rented conference space, she understood something her stepmother never had. You didn't need the world to watch you. You just needed the right people. Her hands pressed flat against the podium. Her father's notebook, the DNA report, and Helen's affidavit sat in front of her neatly stacked. This was her war now. Her voice came steady when she began. My name is Scarlet Anderson. The cameras blinked awake. You've read the headlines. You've heard the stories. A pause. My stepmother wants you to believe I'm unstable, that I'm bitter, that I'm lost. Scarlet glanced down, her jaw tightening, then lifted her gaze, steel returning to her eyes. But what I am is the last Anderson left. The room shifted. A few pens stopped moving. Scarlet pulled the DNA report forward, holding it up without hesitation. This is the paternity test my father ordered before he died. It proves that Dylan Reed Anderson is not his biological son. A ripple through the crowd. Next, she slid the affidavit closer. This is a sworn statement from my father's personal assistant confirming my father intended to remove Dylan from the inheritance trust after discovering the truth. And finally, she laid down the copy of the forged will. And this, Scarlet said, her voice cold, is the version of my father's will that was filed after his death. A document that legal experts confirm does not bear his authentic signature. She let the silence hold. I have filed for full legal restoration of my father's estate, and I'm not stopping. A reporter's voice broke through. Scarlet, are you claiming fraud? She met his gaze directly. I'm claiming theft. Another question sharper. What about your mental health evaluation? Scarlet's jaw flexed, but she answered evenly. My father trusted me with this legacy. That trust is what matters. Someone else called out. Why come forward now? Scarlet looked into the cameras. Because I refuse to let my family's name die in silence. She stepped back. The flashbulbs ignited. Questions blurred together. Shouts. Microphones shoved forward. But Scarlet was already moving. She didn't wait for the next soundbite. She'd said what mattered, and the world would decide what came next. By nightfall they had. Anderson inheritance bombshell. DNA scandal, Heiress claims fake brother. Scarlet Anderson versus the legacy that denied her. Her face older, sharper now than the photos from her youth flashed across every screen. Her name trended for hours. But the spotlight wasn't warmth. It burned. Scarlet sat curled on the couch, eyes fixed on the television, watching strangers dissect her life in 30-second segments. Some called her brave. Others called her broken. Some believed her. Many did not. The public didn't need evidence. They needed drama. And Scarlet had just handed them both. When the knock came, she jumped. Her heart spiked. But it was only the mail. She retrieved the envelope silently from her doorstep. No return address. Heavy paper. Inside a single sheet. No words, just an image. A photograph of her mother's gravestone. Defaced. Black paint sprayed over her mother's name. Scarlet stood motionless in the doorway, staring down at the picture until her vision blurred. Then her fingers tightened around the photo, crushing it in her fist. She didn't scream. Didn't cry. She just closed the door, locked it, and slid the deadbolt. That night, Scarlet didn't sleep. She sat on the floor back against the wall, staring at the door until dawn. Not out of fear, but calculation. Someone wanted her scared. Someone wanted her to run. But they'd miscalculated. Scarlet Anderson didn't run. Not anymore. The iron gates of the Anderson estate creaked open just wide enough for Scarlet to step through. She didn't flinch. Not when the weight of 7 years pressed down on her with every step she took up the gravel path. Not when the marble lions came into view again. And not when she saw Evelyn Anderson herself waiting on the front porch, silhouetted in the afternoon light. Scarlet stopped at the foot of the stairs. Evelyn hadn't aged. Not in the way real people did. Her skin was smooth, her hair pinned back flawlessly, every inch of her curated. She wore black, not out of mourning, but because power dressed in shadows. You shouldn't have come here, Evelyn said softly. Scarlet said nothing. Evelyn's voice was calm, surgical. You look like her, you know. Your mother. Scarlet's stomach tightened. I see it in the jaw, in the stubbornness. Scarlet kept her silence. Evelyn stepped down one marble step, slow, deliberate. Her voice was gentle, almost maternal. She was weak. Scarlet blinked. She played housewife like it was a role to be earned. Evelyn continued, eyes glinting. She thought loyalty was love. She thought submission was safety. Scarlet's breath caught. Evelyn smiled softly, tilting her head like she was explaining a fact to a child. But in the end, your father didn't want a woman he could protect. He wanted a woman who could replace him. Scarlet's voice cracked out of her. Stop! Evelyn's smile widened. And I did. Scarlet took a slow step back. Evelyn's tone shifted low-cold. You're making her mistake now. Thinking truth wins. Scarlet's lips parted, but no sound came. She cried, you know, Evelyn whispered. The day I locked her out of this house. You were at school. Scarlet's entire body shook. I didn't even need to shout. Evelyn added, eyes soft with venom. I just closed the door. Silence fell between them, until Evelyn spoke once more. And you, Scarlet, you're just her with sharper teeth. That's when Scarlet turned. Not from weakness, but because if she stayed 1 second longer, she'd break her own rules. Evelyn didn't follow. Didn't need to. Scarlet's footsteps down the driveway sounded louder than before, like war drums muffled in her own pulse. She made it past the gates before her vision blurred. She didn't stop walking, not even when the tears came. The cemetery was quiet. Scarlet knelt by the gravestone, her throat raw palms pressed flat against the cold earth. Elizabeth Anderson, her mother. She traced the letters like they were braille, as if reading could undo forgetting. I'm sorry, she whispered. The tears came then heavy silent. Not for Evelyn, not even for the empire stolen from her, but for the woman whose voice she couldn't remember anymore. Scarlet let the memories take her. She saw herself 10 years old, hiding behind the staircase, peeking through the banister, as Evelyn's voice cut through the house like a knife. You don't belong here, Elizabeth. Scarlet remembered her mother's silence, the way her shoulders curled inward, the way she whispered Charles wouldn't. He's not here. Scarlet remembered her mother's trembling hands as she packed a single suitcase, remembered clutching her small pink backpack, asking Mommy, where are we going? And remembered the way her mother cried when she couldn't answer. That night, Evelyn locked the door behind them. Scarlet remembered pounding on it, sobbing, calling for her father. He never came. Scarlet wiped her eyes now, her breath shaking, her voice a rasp. I'm not leaving this time. The wind shifted through the trees. She stayed there beside her mother's grave until the sky dimmed and the chill crept into her skin. When she finally stood, she felt hollow, but not empty. Her grief had weight, and she was ready to carry it. She turned toward the distant city lights and walked back toward the fight. The courtroom felt colder than Scarlet expected, not from the air, but from the eyes, from the silence, from the weight of her father's name written above the judge's bench, carved into old wood like a monument to a family she no longer recognized. Evelyn sat 2 tables away, Dylan at her side. Scarlet kept her chin raised, but her heart was pounding hard enough to bruise. All rise. The judge entered. Scarlet stood. She didn't breathe. Today's hearing concerns the preliminary challenge against Ms. Scarlet Anderson's claim of inheritance and leadership capacity over Anderson Holdings. Scarlet's fists tightened against her sides. And then Evelyn stood, in her tailored charcoal suit, every word already rehearsed. Your Honor, it pains me to say this about my own stepdaughter. Evelyn began, her voice the perfect balance of sorrow and authority. But the truth is, Scarlet has suffered from emotional instability for years. Scarlet's stomach turned. She watched as Evelyn placed the forged documents neatly before the judge, a compiled history of false medical evaluations, witness statements, and psychiatric observations. Scarlet's eyes widened as she realized whose name was on the reports. Her own. I submit to the court, Evelyn continued smoothly, that Ms. Anderson is incapable of managing complex legal and corporate responsibilities. In fact, my concern extends to her personal safety. The words hit harder than any slap. Scarlet stepped forward, barely able to speak. That's a lie! Evelyn glanced at her then, not as a rival, but as a patient. I only want what's best for her. Scarlet felt her pulse roar in her ears. I've never been treated for... Evelyn's attorney cut her off, handing more papers to the clerk. Scarlet couldn't hear their words anymore. All she saw was the judge reading, nodding, believing. I recommend, Your Honor. Evelyn concluded that Ms. Anderson undergo a mandatory psychiatric evaluation before these proceedings continue. The silence afterward was worse than the accusation. The judge looked up, cold, professional. I agree. Scarlet's legs almost buckled. No, she whispered. I'm ordering a court-appointed evaluation. Ms. Anderson will comply. Scarlet felt the last piece of herself fracture. Her father had once said a courtroom was the last place truth lived. Now she understood. The gavel fell. Scarlet didn't remember walking out. The courthouse steps were chaos. Reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Questions clawed from every direction. Scarlet, are you being forced into a psych evaluation? Is it true you've been hospitalized before? Did you falsify claims about Dylan? Scarlet kept walking. Her vision blurred. Her body moved like it belonged to someone else. She pushed through the reporters until she reached the sidewalk. And then she stopped. Frozen. She looked back once. Just once. And saw Evelyn at the top of the stairs, answering calmly, posing softly. The press loved her. Scarlet turned away. She wanted to scream. To run. To disappear. Her father's name was collapsing, and she couldn't stop it. She sat on the curb. Tears threatened but didn't fall. Instead, she whispered to herself, maybe I really am losing it. Because in that moment, Scarlet believed Evelyn might win. And worse, she believed Evelyn might be right. The package wasn't delivered. It was placed. Scarlet found it sitting silently outside her apartment door just after midnight, a small brown envelope, no markings, no note. Her heart tightened when she saw it. She already knew who sent it. She didn't hesitate. Inside a flash drive. No explanation. She locked the door behind her, shoved a chair beneath the handle, and crossed the dark apartment to her laptop. Her hands trembled as she plugged the drive in. One file, dated 2 days before her father's death. Scarlet clicked play. Her father's voice filled the silence. Ragged, exhausted, but unmistakably his. "If you're hearing this, I didn't fix it in time." Scarlet froze. Tears stung her eyes instantly. "Dylan isn't mine." Her father's voice cracked. "I have the test. I trusted her and I shouldn't have. If she wins, Scarlet loses everything. Everything I built." Silence. A shaky breath. "Scar, if this reaches you." "No, I tried. I should have listened sooner. I should have trusted you." Then static. The file ended. Scarlet sat there shaking. Her father had known, and he'd died believing he failed her. The tears came fast, burning down her cheeks. She cried until her chest hurt, until her voice cracked from whispering, "Dad, I'm sorry." But then she stopped. She wiped her face, sat up straighter, and dragged the DNA file onto the flash drive beside her father's recording. Her decision was made. She wasn't going to fight in court anymore. She was going to fight in the light. 3 hours later, the world woke up to war. Scarlet stood alone at the press conference. No lawyers, no advisors, just truth. "This is the last recording of Charles Anderson," she said simply, then pressed play. She didn't elaborate, didn't explain. She let her father's words destroy the silence. Anderson Corporation's founder, admitting with no hesitation that Dylan was not his heir. The reporters went still, then chaos. Scarlet stepped back from the podium and handed out copies of the DNA report like press kits. No manipulation, no spin, just proof. She walked out before the first headline posted. By noon, Anderson Corporation's stock dropped 17%. By evening, it crashed 32%. And the headlines burned brighter than Evelyn's empire. Anderson founder exposes paternity fraud in deathbed recording. Scarlet Anderson's war against stepfamily goes public. Dylan Reed, the false heir. Scarlet watched it all from her apartment. The empire that erased her was collapsing. And this time she didn't have to knock on the door. She'd burned the house down. Scarlet didn't sleep. Not after the video dropped. Not after the headlines. Not after the phone started ringing. Not friends, not lawyers. Reporters, strangers, threats. The collapse had begun, and Evelyn knew. Scarlet felt it in her bones the moment her laptop shut down without warning. It wasn't a glitch. It was a message. She rebooted. The files were gone. Her father's recording. Her DNA report. Deleted. She checked her phone. Blank. Contacts erased. Messages missing. And then the real message came, just 3 words flashing across her email screen like a knife. "You were warned." Scarlet froze. Her chest tightened. She felt Evelyn's hand in this, not a direct strike. A shadow. A ghost. Scarlet stood backed away from the screen, panic twisting sharp in her stomach. She knew enough to recognize what was happening, a targeted breach. Coordinated, professional. Evelyn had gone nuclear. Scarlet bolted. She didn't stop to think. She grabbed the flash drive, the physical one, the only copy left, and ran. The streets blurred past her windshield. Rain hammered the glass, the wipers useless against the storm. Then she saw them. Headlights. In her rearview mirror. Too close. Too fast. Scarlet's heart slammed into her ribs. She gripped the wheel tighter, pushed the gas harder, the delivery van screaming as it surged forward. But the black car behind her didn't fall back. It accelerated. Her breath broke. Scarlet swerved left. Tires shrieked. She caught a glimpse of the other driver, no face, just a silhouette. The black car rammed her rear bumper. Scarlet's body jolted forward, slammed back against the seat. She lost control. She screamed. The van skidded across wet pavement. She fought the wheel, breathless, blinded. And then, the guardrail. She spun, metal screeching against metal, her shoulder slammed against the door. The world tilted. But somehow the van didn't flip. It stopped. And the black car? Gone. Scarlet sat frozen, staring at her own trembling hands. Alive. Barely. She didn't remember how she drove home. She only remembered locking every door. And collapsing. By morning, Scarlet wasn't scared. She was done. She hired private security within the hour. A man named Reed. Ex-military. He didn't ask questions. Just nodded, loaded a sidearm, and told her, "You move, I move." It wasn't enough. She knew that, because this wasn't a war behind doors anymore. This was a war in the open. So Scarlet did the one thing Evelyn couldn't predict. She gave everything away. She uploaded it. Every file. The paternity report. The forged will. The deathbed recording. All of it. Posted unfiltered across every platform. No edits. No commentary. Just truth. The internet caught fire. By sunset, the streets outside Parker Tower flooded with bodies. Scarlet watched from the safety of her hotel room. Her apartment wasn't safe now. She saw the protests ignite like gasoline. People carried signs. Anderson is a lie. The real heiress speaks. Trust blood, not money. Scarlet didn't ask for this, but the people came anyway. Her father's name no longer whispered in shame. It was shouted in the streets. And Evelyn? She stayed behind locked glass walls. For the first time, she was the one trapped. The final day felt quieter than Scarlet expected. The courtroom was full, packed with reporters, shareholders, strangers who whispered her name but had never spoken to her. Yet everything felt distant, muffled. Scarlet sat at the plaintiff's table, Reed stationed silently behind her. Beside her, Helen gripped her hand once, then let go. Evelyn entered late. She looked thinner, paler, but her eyes still burned. Dylan followed her like a shadow. His suit was immaculate. His expression wasn't. He didn't look at Scarlet. He didn't look at anyone. All rise. Scarlet stood. The judge spoke, but she barely heard. This wasn't about law anymore. It was reckoning. Evelyn's attorney opened first. Calm. Precise. Controlled. He presented financial charts, family photos, charity lists, spinning the same story. Evelyn, the loyal widow, safeguarding her husband's empire from a delusional stepdaughter. Scarlet listened without blinking. Then her name was called. She stood. She didn't shake. She didn't look at Evelyn. She faced the judge and pressed play. Her father's voice filled the courtroom. If something happens to me, Dylan isn't mine. Every breath in the room held. Scarlet watched Evelyn stiffen, watched Dylan flinch. She handed over the DNA report next. Medical certified. Signed. 0%. This, Scarlet said softly, is the proof he tried to leave me. Evelyn's chair scraped back. She stood. I object. This is fabricated. This is all lies. Her voice cracked in the courtroom. No one stopped her. She wasn't speaking to the judge. She was unraveling. Scarlet turned to face her. I know the truth killed him. Evelyn's hands trembled. Scarlet's voice didn't. And now it ends. The silence afterward felt endless. Then the judge's gavel fell once. Court rules in favor of the plaintiff. The original Anderson Trust is reinstated. All successor claims by Evelyn Anderson and Dylan Reed Anderson are hereby revoked. Evelyn's knees buckled. Dylan sat down slowly, head in his hands. Scarlet didn't move, didn't cry, didn't speak. She just breathed. The legacy wasn't stolen anymore. It was hers. Not the empire, not the money. The truth, and this time Evelyn couldn't erase her. It happened faster than Scarlet expected. Within days of the verdict, Evelyn Anderson's name wasn't whispered in high society. It was spat. Headlines didn't soften the blow. Evelyn Anderson, the widow who stole an empire. Dylan Reed, the heir who never was. Paparazzi cornered them outside hotels, grocery stores, parking lots. Evelyn swatted cameras with shaking hands, snarling like a cornered animal. Dylan stopped leaving the house at all. Banks closed their doors. Charities cut ties. Old friends, board members, even their lawyers disappeared overnight. They weren't pariahs. They were poison. And Scarlet watched it all unfold from the office that once belonged to her father, Anderson Tower. Corner office. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking a city built on her family's name. She stood behind her father's old desk, the weight of inherited power settling around her like ash. Her legal team waited. The board waited. She said nothing for a long time. Then finally she spoke. Sell it. The entire room froze. Her attorney blinked. I'm sorry. Scarlet's voice didn't waver. Sell everything. But you won. Scarlet's gaze never left the skyline. I didn't win, she said softly. I survived. The lawyer hesitated. Scarlet Anderson Corporation is worth over the... I know what it's worth. She turned. And the room fell silent. Turn it into something that saves people. But I don't care how you do it. I don't want a seat at their table. Scarlet's voice was colder than the glass around her. I want to burn the table down. Silence. Then the lawyer nodded. The order was given. And the empire crumbled. Not because Evelyn stole it, but because Scarlet refused to keep it. She left the office that night without looking back. She'd carried her father's name far enough. Now it was time to carry her own. The ink dried without ceremony. Scarlet stood at the long oak conference table, papers stacked neatly before her. Around her, silence. The lawyers didn't speak. Neither did the board members. There were no congratulations, no handshakes. Everyone understood. This wasn't a victory. It was closure. Across from her sat the new director of the Anderson Foundation, a woman named Mara Layton. Scarlet had chosen her carefully, someone who didn't carry the weight of the Anderson name or the poison of its legacy, someone who knew how to build. I don't want it tied to me, Scarlet said, simply sliding the final file across the table. Mara glanced down at the official founding charter. The Anderson Foundation, a global trust for single mothers and orphaned children, funded by every last cent from the sale of Anderson Holdings. Mara looked up. You could have kept it. Scarlet shook her head. It's never really been mine. Mara studied her for a long moment, then said softly, What should I tell them? Tell them it was my mother's idea. That was all. Scarlet turned and walked away. She never looked back. The house looked smaller than she remembered. Scarlet stood at the gates of the Anderson estate, the same gates that once slammed shut behind her. Now they stood open, but she didn't step inside. She carried nothing with her but a single envelope. The air smelled like old pine. Rain lingered in the stone. Everything felt like a memory worn thin. She moved slowly up the path until she reached the front door. She didn't knock. Instead, she knelt, placed the envelope carefully against the heavy wood, and whispered, This is yours now. Inside the envelope, a single letter, handwritten. No press releases. No official statements. Just the words she never had the courage to say until now. I choose freedom over legacy. I choose silence over their names. I choose peace. And I hope one day you do too. She stood, stepped back, and walked away from the house that once broke her. The gates didn't close behind her this time. She did. In the distance, the city waited, but Scarlet didn't hurry. She took each step slowly, like someone learning to breathe again. For the first time in years, the storm was behind her. The letter sat in Scarlet's lap, folded once, her handwriting careful, deliberate. She'd rewritten it 5 times, but this version she didn't edit. She slipped it into the envelope, left it on the Foundation's desk. No press conference, no audience, just the words. I choose dignity over legacy. I choose my mother's silence over my father's empire. I choose humanity, not wealth. She signed it simply, Scarlet, then walked away. At the cemetery, the air was still. Scarlet knelt beside her mother's grave, fingertips brushing the etched stone like fragile skin. Hi, Mom, her voice cracked. She sat there for a long time, knees in the grass, tears drying unnoticed on her cheeks. I did it! A pause, and I let it go. Her throat tightened. They won't know your name, but they'll know what you gave me. The wind stirred. Scarlet closed her eyes. I wish you could have seen it. Another long silence, then softer. I wish I'd told you thank you. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone and whispered, Goodbye. It wasn't a goodbye to her mother. It was a goodbye to the girl who once thought a house could be a home. She stood, left the flowers, and walked away this time without looking back. The classroom was small. Fluorescent lights, wobbly desks. No more than a dozen women sat scattered across the room, single mothers, ex-con survivors, women the world forgot. Scarlet set her worn legal textbooks on the desk. First lesson, she said softly, there's no such thing as powerless. They watched her, waiting. She smiled and began to teach, not law, but how to fight. And for the first time in her life, Scarlet wasn't defending a family name. She was building futures, quietly, without headlines, and that felt like healing. The road was narrow, worn asphalt cracked at the edges, flanked by trees shedding their autumn gold like memories drifting to the earth. Scarlet rode slowly. Her bicycle creaked with each turn of the pedals, not built for speed, but she wasn't in a hurry. Not anymore. The wind caught her hair. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, fractured light dappling her face. She wasn't dressed like the woman who once sat in courtrooms or boardrooms. No black suits, no silk, just a loose sweater. Denim. Boots dusted with dirt. She looked like someone free. As the road curved, she coasted, hands loose on the handlebars, eyes steady ahead. Her voice rose in the quiet, not spoken aloud, but threaded like thought through the rustling of the trees. Betrayal made me strong, but compassion kept me human. Her breath caught for a moment after the words, but not from sadness, from truth. She pedaled forward deeper into the forest. The sun cut across her path like a soft blade, shadows chasing light between the branches. Every push of her foot was a step further from who she'd once been, a step toward who she was now. Ahead, the road narrowed into a wooden bridge stretched over a slow, deep river. The current moved lazy and cold beneath it, carrying away whatever the world chose to surrender. Scarlet crossed halfway and stopped. She stepped off the bicycle, stood in silence. Then from her pocket she pulled a small object. The key. Her father's key. Once the symbol of her inheritance, of her battle, of everything she thought she needed to reclaim. Scarlet studied it for a long moment. Her thumb brushed its cold, smooth surface. And then she let it fall. The key slipped from her hand like a memory released. It struck the surface of the river with a sound no louder than breath, and vanished, carried downstream. Scarlet watched until even the ripples disappeared. And then she smiled, soft, tired, but free. She turned, lifted her bicycle, and pedaled forward, leaving the bridge and everything it meant behind her. No more legacies, no more battles, no more names she didn't choose. Just the road, just the future, and her. The screen slowly faded to black. A piano chord rose soft but certain, and the credits rolled in silence.